Hello and welcome. In this lecture video, I'm going to be talking about various financial ratios. And as I was saying in the first lecture video, these ratios are divided into several different categories. The first category is liquidity and efficiency ratios. Then we'll talk about solvency ratios. Then we'll talk about profitability ratios. And then we'll talk about ratios that relate to market prospects. Okay, so remember with liquidity, what we're talking about is the availability of resources, and specifically cash, to meet short-term cash obligations. So do we have enough resources to make payroll, which would be an example of a short-term cash obligation? Do we have enough resources to pay for utilities? Okay, when we talk about efficiency, we're talking about how productive is the company in using its resources? So, for example, how fast do we collect on accounts receivable? That would be an example of an efficiency ratio. Okay, those two are complementary because if you don't use your assets very efficiently, you may not have enough resources to cover your short-term cash obligations, so you might have a liquidity problem. Okay, so let's talk about some terms and ratios. First one is working capital, which is going to be equal to our current assets minus our current liabilities. We need working capital to meet our debt obligations and to purchase inventories and also to take advantage of any cash discounts for purchasing inventory. Remember, we can have, from Accounting 101, we can, if we pay for our merchandise inventory early, we can take advantage of purchase discounts, but doing so, buying it or paying for it early and taking advantage of those discounts means that we need to have the cash available. We have to have working capital. If you have more working capital, it suggests a stronger liquidity position and suggests that the company or the organization is going to have a stronger ability to meet its short-term obligations. The current ratio is another ratio that relates to liquidity. And the way we calculate the current ratio is by dividing current assets divided by current liabilities. Now, that means that you know what a current asset is. And remember what a current liability is. So a current asset is an asset that we expect to be turned into cash in 1 year or the operating cycle, whichever is longer. Examples of current assets: cash, accounts receivable, supplies, prepaid assets, merchandise inventory. Current liabilities are those liabilities that we expect to pay within 1 year or the operating cycle, whichever is longer. Examples of current liabilities: accounts payable, utilities payable, okay, interest payable. Those are examples of current liabilities. Also wages payable, another example. If we have a higher current ratio, suggests a stronger liquidity position. But if our current ratio is too high, then we may be holding too much of our assets in current assets. And typically our current assets, such as just keeping cash in the bank account, that could earn a lower rate of return than if we use that cash to invest in a new plant, or invest in a new piece of equipment, or purchase land for expansion. Those can generate higher returns, or they have the potential to generate higher returns than just simply leaving your cash in the bank account. Okay? The acid test ratio, which is also known as the quick ratio, takes a subset of our current assets called our quick assets, divides those by current liabilities. And we've already talked about current liabilities. But examples of quick ratios: cash, short-term investments, and current receivables. So all quick assets are current assets, but not all current assets are quick assets. And that's because quick assets are a subset of our current assets. So we can have current assets such as supplies, merchandise inventory, or prepaid expenses. Those are current assets, examples of current assets, but they are not quick assets. Quick assets that we'll talk about are cash, short-term investments, and current receivables. Okay? So this is another measure of the company's short-term liquidity, and it's similar, as I was saying earlier, to the current ratio, but it looks at those current assets that can be quickly converted into cash without any kind of issues, really. Okay. One efficiency ratio is accounts receivable turnover, and the way that we calculate that is we take our net sales divided by our average accounts receivable net. So after the allowance for doubtful accounts. Remember, this is after the allowance for doubtful accounts. Now, what do we mean by our average accounts receivable? What we mean is our beginning accounts receivable balance plus our ending accounts receivable. So the beginning of the year accounts receivable, and then the end of the accounting period. So beginning of the accounting period plus the ending divided by 2. That gives us our average accounts receivable. The net means it's after the allowance for doubtful accounts. What is this a measure of? How many times a company or an organization converts its receivables into cash? This is really important. It's really important that a company collects its accounts receivable quickly, because if you have outstanding accounts receivable, right? Let's say we have a ton of accounts receivable. I can't use accounts receivable to pay for payroll. I can't pay my employees in accounts receivable. I have to pay them in cash. So if I'm not converting my accounts receivable into cash very quickly, I could run up against not having enough cash to make payroll or pay for utilities. Or I may have to sell my accounts receivable at a discount to then get cash now to pay for utilities or payroll, and that's not something I want to do. So what we really want to do is to make sure that we are collecting on our accounts receivable quickly. Okay? When this ratio is high, that means that we're collecting accounts receivable quickly. So higher is more favorable. Okay? Because it means the company is collecting its accounts receivable faster. Another measure of efficiency is inventory turnover. And the way we calculate this is we take our cost of goods sold from the income statement divided by our average inventory. And similar to what we just talked about average accounts receivable, average inventory is inventory at the beginning of the year plus inventory at the end of the year divided by 2. And then that gives us our average. Our inventory turnover ratio tells us the number of times that merchandise is sold and replaced during the year. Okay? A company with high turnover requires a smaller investment in inventory. Now, this is important, right? Because holding a lot of inventory can be costly. There are inventory holding costs. You might have to, for example, have a bigger warehouse to hold all your inventory. You might have to pay for more insurance on all your inventory. You might have to hire more security guards to watch over all your inventory. So what you want to do is to minimize your inventory holding costs. And one way to do that is to maximize your inventory turnover. Because if you're maximizing your inventory turnover, this is a high turnover ratio, you're selling your inventory pretty quickly. That's what that's telling you. And as you're selling your inventory pretty quickly, that means you may need a smaller warehouse to hold all of your inventory. Now, could it be too high? Yes, it could be too high. Okay? The problem with this is that if we're selling our inventory so quickly, we may run into a situation where we don't have enough inventory to sell. And so then we have to turn customers away by saying, we're out of stock, right? So if it gets too fast, that means you might need to hold more inventory because you don't want to tell your customers you're out of stock, okay? Along the same lines of our accounts receivable turnover, we have the days sales uncollected financial ratio. And the way we calculate this is we take our accounts receivable net, so after the allowance for doubtful accounts, divided by our net sales times 365. And then that shows us how frequently a company collects on its accounts receivables, and it is measured in terms of days. Okay? days. So the ratio is in days. That's why you're multiplying times 365 day year. Okay. We also have a ratio, another efficiency ratio of days sales and inventory. We take our ending inventory, inventory at the end of the accounting period, divided by our cost of goods sold, and multiply it times 365. Again, this is in days, and it's if we have a product that's demanded by customers, this formula tells us how long it takes to sell the customer. Sells the inventory to the customer, I'm sorry. If this number is really low, let's think about this. Let's say that this number is 2. That means you have 2 days worth of sales in inventory. That's what that's telling you. That means you better order some more inventory real fast, because otherwise you're going to run out of inventory and you're going to be telling potential customers, we don't have any more inventory. Okay? So that's what this is telling you, is expressed in days, and as this gets lower, you probably need to order more inventory. We also have our total assets turnover, which basically reflects our ability to use our assets to generate sales. So we take our net sales divided by our average total assets. And again, how do we get average total assets? Beginning assets at the accounting period plus assets at the end of the accounting period divided by 2. And it's a measure of how well do we use our assets to generate sales. We also have solvency ratios. And remember, solvency refers to our ability to cover our long-term obligations. Liquidity was our ability to use our resources. We have enough resources to cover our short-term obligations. Okay? This is longer term. So compared to our liquidity ratios, such as current assets and the current ratio and the quick ratio, our solvency ratios are longer term. Okay? So our first one is our debt ratio and our equity ratio. With our debt ratio, we can express total liabilities divided by total assets. So we're showing total liabilities, our debt, as a percentage of total assets, and our equity, total equity, as a percentage of assets. So if you look over here, we have our debt ratio, and then we have our equity ratio. How did we get 66.7? Well, we took our total liabilities divided by our total liabilities and equity. And as we know from the balance sheet, total liabilities plus equity equals total assets. Okay? So a company is going to be less risky if we contain more equity and less debt. We also have our debt to equity ratio, which we calculate by taking our total liabilities divided by our total equity. And it measures which portion is contributed by creditors. A larger debt to equity ratio implies less opportunity to expand via debt financing. A larger debt to equity ratio is also riskier. We also have the times interest earned. The way we calculate that ratio is we take our income before interest and taxes divided by our interest expense. Okay? It shows the amount of income available to pay our interest expense. It's a common measure of our ability to provide protection to our long-term creditors. The larger the ratio, let's look at that. The larger the ratio means that we have more income before interest and taxes compared to our interest. So the larger this ratio, the less risky we are. Okay, the less risky we are. I'm going to stop this lecture video now, and in the next lecture video, I'm going to talk about profitability ratios, market prospect ratios, and then also look at some example problems. Thank you.